Hello again, everyone. Hope you are well. Matt and Alex with you again on the opening bell this week, where, as usual, we got plenty to talk about. It is a Canelo fight week after all. This week in history, we've got a right upset for you. A shocking moment in the super flyweights from 2017. Doesn't seem that long ago, but then it seems so long ago. The night that Srisaket Sorungvasai beat Chocolatito for the second time and stopped him. That's coming up from 2017. We'll reflect on the action from last week and, of course, Canelo Fight Week coming up as well. I've just been hearing about all the kitchen appliances that Matt Christie is now garnering in his possession. Fantastic. He's joining the 21st century, folks. Something we didn't mention in the pod, he's got a bar at the bottom of his garden as well. What a life. Talk about living your best life. No wonder he's in such a good mood all the time.
Yeah, we have. And you know what? It'd be a lie if I said that bar at the end of the garden wasn't a major, if not the biggest selling point when we came to view this property.
I bet.
But it is. It's fantastic. It's essentially it's like an open shed, but it's big and it does feel like a bit like a beach bar that you get on holiday. So it's quite weather dependent. I'm looking into ways to weatherproof it for the winter. I don't want it to go to waste in the winter. But yeah, it's a shame that since we've moved in, we haven't had the greatest summer, but we have tried to make the most of that. It's also a nice little spot actually to go and do some work, to go and do some writing, away from kind of the house. And I think anybody that likes to write will tell you that if you can get a good setting, a good bit of zen going on, that you've won. You're halfway there, and that's the case out there. So I do like going out there and doing some writing.
Fantastic. Actually, if you've got anyone who knows children's illustrators out there, get in touch with me. Drop me a message. I'm on the lookout for a children's illustrator. I did actually write a children's book during lockdown, and I've never really done any more about it. So if you know anyone or are a children's illustrator, get in touch with me. I'd love to hear from you. Might have a project to work on. Have you got a dartboard in there?
No, it's a sloped roof, so there's definitely room for a pool table. And the condition, if I do get a pool table, I'll have to get a second-hand one. The condition that I've agreed with my good lady wife is that we can then convert that into a table when it's needed as a dining table out there. But the problem with a dartboard, which was one of my daughter's first requests, is that it hasn't got the room up top, that when you throw a dart, because quite naturally in flight it will rise and then dip to go into the dartboard, I think we could have some issues with that. So I don't think it's quite high enough to put a dartboard in there. I haven't completely written it off yet. But the thing is, there's a telly on one side, which I've put in, and then there's like a heater on the other. And they would really be the only places you could get a dartboard on, either where the telly is or where the heater is. And I'm sorry, neither of those two things are budging.
The alternative is you just throw the darts like my mate Herdy, who hurls them basically horizontally as though he's throwing a spear at an impala 100 years ago. So that's the alternative. That's the other way to play darts. So there's no arc at all. It's just a horizontal thrash. But anyway, good luck with all of that project. Let's talk about some of the news lines. One week we spoke so much. I love the openers because we often only have a couple of bullet points, and 20 minutes later we've discussed a whole raft of boxing subjects. So I really enjoy that sort of ad-lib, loose opening to the podcast week to week. One thing we could have spoken about was actually on that Naoya Inoue Japanese bill the other week, and that was the fact that both visually and practically, the Japanese Commission had a very specific policy regarding certain titles, how they were going to describe them, if described at all, and the way in which they would be processed. And that was regarding the fight between Hirioka and Ismail Barossa, Matt. Just for those that didn't follow that story, and I know Hassim tweeted you and I, didn't he, regarding this particular subject. So thanks to Hasim for that. But for those that didn't see it, or for those that have, let's embellish the story.
Well, there was an interim belt. There was an interim champion, Ismael Barroso was the interim champion. And according to the Japanese Commission, they don't recognise interim championships. So the best they could do was allow that to be ruled as an eliminator. So on screen, it was an eliminator. It wasn't in the Japanese record books, it's an eliminator. And the commentators also mentioned that this can't be an interim title, essentially because it's nonsense. And that is the ruling of the Japanese Commission. So 3 cheers for the Japanese Commission. Let's stop pretending that the sanctioning bodies govern the sport. Let's leave it to the governing bodies like the Japanese Commission. And hopefully a few more commissions around the world will pick up on that, because I think what they're doing out in Japan for many different reasons is great. And I think if you watch that bill, which was topped, of course, by one of the best fighters in the sport, a Japanese superstar, the speed with which the fight was going from fight to fight to fight, the lack of hoopla and razzmatazz in between, it was purely all about the boxing. And I think 99% of people that watched that would have thought that was a good bill, even if they didn't necessarily think the main event was overly competitive, even if there were a few grumbles about TJ Dohoney taking on one of the best fighters in the sport. I think the way that bill was constructed from start to finish was excellent. And we've seen that time and time again out in Japan. So, yeah, as I say, well done to the Japanese Commission for very simply just turning around and saying, these interim titles are a load of nonsense. We're not going to recognise them. So well done for that.
Shows you it can be done. And it shows you the knock-on effect for both broadcasters and then for viewers. And the way that you talk about, digest and think about the sport. And if you follow BoxRec at the moment, which I suspect most of our listeners do, then you'll also see that there are no WBA titles there at all. When you look at the list of champions, nada. Upcoming titles, none. I have no idea whether Erislandy Lara against Danny Garcia is for anything this weekend. No idea at all. And I don't really care, to be honest, one way or another. And it's a little bit of a mind shift. It's a little bit of a change in approach. But as you've kind of hinted at with a lot of the spurious titles, we've been talking about this since the pod began, really. But if you can engineer that own change in your own mind, it can be quite refreshing, if a little jolting at first.
Yeah, something that we tried to do back when I was at Boxing News, and a large part of that decision was based upon the spurious timelines of some of these belts. And you're looking at it on BoxRec when they did recognise WBA, and you can see that it's the WBA title. Is that the super title? Is that where's that come from? And you'd spend half your time, as I said back then, when you were writing a preview and you were kind of working out what WBA title this was. How are we going to call it regular? Are we going to call it the secondary title? And in the end, I just went, well, let's not call it anything at all. It's just all nonsense. Let's just focus on the best 10 fighters in the division and give some context to everybody about what these fights really mean. Because the context of where the fighters stand in terms of a top 10, I still believe, means far more than whether there's a sanctioning body title on the line or not. I think we spoke about it last week briefly, didn't we, with the actions of the IBF recently and their haste in stripping champions because they're following their own rules. So on one hand, you can say that's fair enough, but then you look at why those champions are being stripped or essentially forced to relinquish, and you go, hang on a minute, what has this guy done to cause so much chaos in the division? And I think with BoxRec, they've taken a stand against WBA. We know there's a lot going on behind the scenes between the WBA and BoxRec. There has been for a long time. We also know that Turki Alalshikh has ties now with the WBA through sponsorship, etc. And we also know that Turki Alalshikh has publicly tweeted his displeasure with BoxRec, largely because their rankings don't stack with his own. Which I think is troublesome, really, in terms of throwing toys out the pram, that kind of thing. Because really, if you're going to lose your mind over rankings, just a bit of advice for the old Turkmeister General. Probably boxing isn't the place to come if you want a sane mind when you're looking at rankings, particularly when they're computerised ones on BoxRec. I think there are more sensible steps to take if that is what's bothering you. And I think the sensible steps to take would be to adopt some independent rankings and just look at those, which is what we try to do at Boxing News. That philosophy is no longer the case at Boxing News, and that's completely fair enough. I think really that the media at large is as to blame for this mess as any of the sanctioning bodies, because everybody embraced them. I'm at Boxing Scene now, and we mention all of the titles as well, because they're so ingrained in the consciousness of the sport, aren't they? But as you say, Lara Garcia this week, I mean, that is for a WBA middleweight title, even though Danny Garcia hasn't fought any higher than junior middleweight, hasn't fought for the best part of 2 years, hasn't got any form at middleweight whatsoever, yet his first fight in the division, even though he's never weighed officially any more than 152 3/4 pounds, will be to fight for a world middleweight title. Make of that what you will.
Yeah, though in truth they've been doing it for a while, and not just that particular organisation. They've been doing it elsewhere, haven't they? I mean, you can go back to Canelo against Cotto in 2015, Matt, can't you? Around that time when, Cotto was never a middleweight. Canelo at the time wasn't a middleweight, and those were fighters that were being pushed together for a middleweight title.
Yeah, I hear that, and then there would also be the catch weight that the fighters were allowed to dictate what weight it would be, even though
and also
a long-established weight.
And another one I noticed as well was when they just going through some details the other day. There was when De La Hoya fought Hopkins. I'd completely forgotten this, but that was, I think, to make the fight. I think Hopkins had to basically agree a catch weight, and that fight was actually at 156 or something like that, I think.
And that's what you get, and I suppose you can understand certain decisions being made, and I just grumble there about Garcia never having fought at middleweight, yet he's being granted a world title shot in his first fight in the division. No, that isn't anything new. That was going on in the 90s. It's been going on since day dot, hasn't it? You had fighters moving between weights and challenging for titles in their first fight in the division. But largely it's because they were deemed to have dominated one division and they would step up and they would be granted a title shot. It's not the case with people like Danny Garcia. Now, Danny Garcia's had a fantastic career, don't get me wrong. But the world was not necessarily waiting with bated breath for when he was going to invade the middleweights. And I find it bothersome, I think. Not necessarily that the fight is allowed to take place in the first place. It's that these fighters are taking up valuable ranking positions without being active in a particular weight class. Like Errol Spence, for example, who is currently atop the WBC junior middleweight rankings. Whether he will ever step foot in a prize ring again, we just don't know.
And I suppose what we're going to have for as long as the Saudi revolution lasts is you're going to have some ideas thrust forward, some that will jolt and jar the business, some that will prick up the ears of boxing fans for sure. And we might just see a bit of that or a lot of that over the next few years. You said last week in the pod that there's plenty of ideas or ways to look at the sport that Turki Alalshikh actually shares with some of your own visions for the benefit of boxing. And with that in mind, I just wanted to talk about the upcoming November bill. That's been tagged for Saudi on November 16th. We got confirmation that Chris Billam-Smith is going to fight Gilberto Ramirez, for 2 titles, but it's not going to be in America his preferred first choice. But he said he'd go wherever the money or wherever the fight had to be made, and it is November 16th in Saudi. It's billed as a kind of Latino-influenced fight card, Matt, with the likes of Ramirez against Barbosa, Zepeda against Tevin Farmer as well. There'll be more meat on the bones of that. But the really interesting strapline is the possibility that this might be free to air. And that's one of the ideas that you mooted last week on the podcast, perhaps for the betterment of the sport. Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, Alalshikh tweeted that he'd been in discussions with Oscar De La Hoya, who will be the kind of official promoter for that event, and that they had agreed that they need to get this out there for free. It needs to be on a free-to-air channel. People don't need to have to dip in and pay. I mean, already they're working hard, you can see, to try and bring down the cost of pay-per-views. I think the impending Daniel Dubois, Anthony Joshua fight will just be $19.99 in America, as well as £19.95 over here, or $19.99. So although we can look at what they are doing with as much concern as excitement, I think what we can't accuse them of at this juncture is closing their ears and not listening to what people are saying. Now, whether or not Turki Alalshikh is a particular fan of any criticism, and one may conclude that he's not by the fact that this time last week, I think he was following around 100 boxing journalists on Twitter, and now he doesn't follow a single one, doesn't follow anybody on Twitter, which suggests he wants his timeline free from any criticism. But one of the things that people have said, and we've said it on this podcast, and I think we said it long before Turki Alalshikh was the main figure in Saudi Arabia, that if the aim is to open up what Saudi boxing are doing to the world, therefore to open up the country to the world, but more so open up the sport to the world, then why on earth, if money is no object, or it's most certainly not the sizable object it is for everybody else working in boxing, why are they so insistent on this going on pay-per-view channels? Therefore, you are immediately taking away an awful lot of people that would just sit and watch it. Now, that does appear to be in their thinking. How can they get more people watching this sport? Because having had a conversation with Turki Alalshikh in the past, and one of his biggest drivers is numbers, that he won't really have been happy, I wouldn't imagine, behind the scenes, that only 1 million people, or just over 1 million people, bought Alexander Usyk versus Tyson Fury. Particularly when one considers that it was probably the most important fight that the sport has staged in this century, particularly when you compare it to events in the not-so-distant past that were generating over 4 million buys. Particularly when you compare it to fights of last century where tens of millions of people would watch. That was a problem that they now appear to be addressing. How they take that forward and how sustainable that is, we wait and see. But if you want to make a statement, I think the biggest one of all is not actually the fights that they make. It's how they ensure that as many people as possible watch those fights without having to pay for them, because I think that has been the biggest bugbear from fans, is that most certainly in this century and in the last 10 years in particular, although there is probably more boxing available to watch, it is coming at an almighty cost. Once you've paid your Sky subscription, you may have to pay separately for TNT. Then you've got DAZN on top of that. There's all of the smaller channels as well. That if they can somehow bypass that and make it accessible to all, then that, I think, is the biggest statement they can possibly make.
It's really interesting. What that will do, Matt, is, because obviously that's about exposure for the sport and the potential growth for the sport. That is the end goal, and that's the bigger picture. But more immediately, in a sport that is dominated by self-interest and subjectivity, from the fighters, through their managers, through their promoters, then on to the broadcasters, and so on, that in that world, juggling the dynamics of all of those things, where you have relationships, if not necessarily contracts, with certain people, whether it's Saudi Arabia and Frank Warren, Saudi Arabia and Eddie Hearn Matchroom, Saudi Arabia now and Golden Boy and Top Rank, and so on and so forth. And therefore, you have links to Sky, to now with Ben Shalom, with being involved in the party as well. You have links to DAZN, you have links stateside to broadcasters over there as well. And they all want to make a buck, and they all have their own relationships with the promoters. So it's a web, and it's a tangled one, and that is an operation that will need to be juggled. Now, you can offset a lot of that with money. The fighters can be placated. They don't really care necessarily where they're shown. I know Anthony Joshua's had his own relationship with Sky, but essentially, if they're getting weighed in at the same as they would do for a big pay-per-view, the fighters would be happy. But the other relationships, those are balls that need to be juggled, and I wonder how much money can simply offset all of that.
I think if you were to speak privately to certain promoters about this Saudi revolution, each of them will say that for now they have to embrace it, they have to be seen in public to be supportive of it. But I would be astonished if a single one of them were convinced that they could now put their feet up, not worry about the business models that they have spent more or less their entire working lives constructing, and just say, well, job is done. The money is going to keep flowing in. All we got to do is keep pushing the fighters over to these paymasters, and we are going to get paid handsomely. I think privately, each of them will be aware that this could stop at any moment, or it could slow down at any moment. The money flow could slow down at any moment, and therefore they will need to ensure that all of their businesses are in order, so that if it does stop, they can then move forward without all of the millions that are currently pouring in. But we can criticise them for making friends when they were previously enemies. We can criticise them for holding hands with Turki Alalshikh in public. But I think as business people, as they all are, they'd be idiots not to get involved at the moment. But I also am pretty confident that each of them who are now involved are keeping a very close eye on the bigger picture.
And interestingly, with those kind of dynamics in mind, it is worth watching a recent BBC documentary about effectively about the succession to the throne, if you like, in Saudi Arabia of Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, who he's known as, who is effectively the driving force behind change in Saudi Arabia. But and it's about how he came to power, the journey. But what you get a sense of from that BBC doc is the balance or the difficulty for someone in his position, or maybe a regime like that, of balancing the push for change with how you do that, and therefore how you perhaps suppress opposition or quieten voices who are dissenting. And that's a really interesting dynamic at the heart of that documentary. And it's, in a sense, we're seeing a bit of that played out in the current Saudi revolution and their approach to boxing as well. There's lots of fresh ideas. There's lots of potential positive change for the sport. But if you're not chiming with the tune, as we've seen recently with the spat between Saudi or Turkey and Canelo, then maybe to hell with you. So that's worth watching that documentary, because it does sort of have implications for how all of this Saudi revolution is unfolding for our sport. And that whole free-to-air issue is going to be really interesting to watch unfold. We heard that Conceição against Oshaki Foster, such a controversial fight or decision that went to Conceição for Oshaki Foster's hard-fought, hard-earned title, and lots of kerfuffle, lots of dissenting voices in that one, Matt. And it looks like actually that is now on also for November.
Yeah, that looks like it's signed and sealed for November 2. The WBC, to their credit, said that the rematch had to occur. Both fighters have agreed to it. Foster, of course, was enraged. That's what he wanted from the moment he heard the scores. He was lobbying for it. Credit to Conceição, ultimately put in a bit of a position where if he wanted to keep his title, he had to engage in the immediate rematch. So yeah, I'm really pleased. I mean, I've kind of gone. I've juggled with this whole idea of bad decisions and whether they can be overturned in front of a committee. And I think I am back to the thinking that probably that will open a can of worms. I think it's fine to have an opinion on something and digest it. And if you really do some research into something and then you decide, actually, I think the better way is this, that's fine. I think that's where I'm at with that now. And I think the better course of action with boxing in its current climate, when there isn't hundreds and hundreds of people sitting on committees, they can't all drop everything to look into certain cases, is that, okay, that was a bit dodgy. The best thing we can do is ensure that they're both paid. The party that feels like they're wronged gets the chance to put that right as soon as possible. The fighter who was perhaps the beneficiary of a controversial decision is also paid, gets to defend their title, gets to defend their position, as it were, and they have an immediate rematch, and that's the case. I think the thing with Jack Catterall and Josh Taylor that bothered me, and I know there were things going on behind the scenes. I know that Josh Taylor had certain mandatory requirements that he was trying to juggle. I know that he had injuries he was trying to clear. But the fact that dragged on and on and on for such a long time, when most people felt that an injustice was done, I think is bothersome for the sport of boxing. But if we can do this, okay, that was a dodgy decision, let's have an immediate rematch, then I think that is a better course of action.
And with that in mind, because, obviously, say Jeff Fenech, for example, against Azuma Nelson in their first fight, which we've dealt with on this pod in This Week in History previously, not that long ago. WBC late last year or early this year, effectively turning round that controversial decision. Does that mean now that we say Jeff Fenech is a 4-weight world champion? Historically, what's the way to approach that?
No, we can't. Of course we can't. No, we can't, because, I mean, I think it comes from a good place when the WBC do things like that. They do it at conventions. They know that it means a lot to Jeff Fenech. Jeff Fenech has been a friend of the WBC for quite a long time. He is not quiet about his displeasure in that first Azuma Nelson fight. But no, we can't have a sanctioning body overturning results that took place 30 years ago and rewriting the record books as a consequence. And I think if you look at the record books, that is still a draw. It is not a win for Jeff Fenech. And I think in the same way that we have to take these extra belts that the WBC produce for certain fights with a pinch of salt, we have to do the same with things like that. That's not downplaying Jeff Fenech's fury or his achievements. That's just saying that we can't just do that kind of on the spur of the moment or ad hoc. It's let's not mess around with history too much. I think we live in a world at the moment where we do want to go back and correct certain things in history or pretend certain things in history haven't happened or occurred. But ultimately, my own point of view in that is that things did happen in history. The key, of course, is to learn from them, not attempt to go back and look at them with retrospectively and attempt to change things that happened and are a point of fact. So no, we don't call Fenech a 4-weight champion now. I understand what the WBC were trying to do there, but they're not in a position to rewrite record books in the same way that they're not in a position to say that a failed drug test doesn't matter.
Exactly. Indeed. It's more of a kind of honorary statement than anything else, isn't it? Really. Right. One final newsline that I wanted to just discuss or just get out there. Anthony Fowler, I think, was on TalkSport. I didn't see the interview, but I've seen one or two of the lines that he's kind of stoked the fire on AJ Dubois, hasn't he? Upcoming. A lot of fans love this stuff, some don't. But he was saying he was there when they sparred back in around 2016, when Dubois reportedly or factually did hurt Joshua, and the spar was stopped. What are the kind of details of this through the words and eyes of Fowler?
Yeah, I mean, Anthony Fowler has gone into detail about a spar that we all presume occurred. I think the first time the vast majority of people will have heard about this spar was back in 2017 when Frank Warren was talking about it, saying this is the kid that knocked Anthony Joshua out in sparring. He's going to go on and rule the world. It was a fantastic marketing tool for Frank Warren back then. And it was only a matter of time when Dubois and Joshua agreed to fight that this sparring tale would come out the woodwork and gain a life of its own. And Fowler has really added some meat to those bones that have been knocking around in the background for quite a number of years now. He was there. He saw Joshua get the best of most of the sparring. He saw Daniel Dubois take it easy. He saw Daniel Dubois then land a short left hook on the inside. Joshua's legs went rubbery. Joshua wanted to fight on. Robert McCracken said, stop the sparring, let your legs come back under you. And Anthony Fowler said something along the lines of, if he could do that in 18-ounce gloves and head guards, if he connects like that, he's going to put Anthony Joshua to sleep. Now, from this interview that was conducted by TalkSport, numerous daily newspapers jumped on it. And from their point of view, it's a second-hand interview. And this is the opening line from a national daily newspaper story on this from yesterday. And Daniel Dubois almost KO'd Anthony Joshua during a sparring session, but stopped out of respect. Whoa, man, that sounds heavy. Alex, what is sparring?
It's
sparring is sparring. Sparring is sparring.
Sparring, schmarring is an opportunity to learn your craft. You listen to George Groves talking about sparring. I mean, I suppose you talk to different boxers, they'll say different things. I think for someone like Froch always wants to get the better of you, even if you're walking down the street or you're fighting in a ring. So he'd have a different approach. But Groves was always happy to perfect his craft. And therefore, that meant if you put yourself in danger and took some licks, then he was prepared to do that to get better. So I suppose they'll all have a different take on it, but it's also a long while ago. They're both different fighters. That'd be around the time that Joshua was, Fury just won the world title. Joshua was about to go and beat Charles Martin, and then Klitschko just round the corner.
Mate, exactly right. Sparring is very rarely a case of two fighters getting together, each of their corners going, right, you got to win this, go all out. Sparring generally, particularly a sparring session like this, will have been designed for one fighter, in this case Joshua, and the person who is essentially employing the other one to perfect certain punches, certain combinations, to familiarise themselves with certain situations and certain techniques. And I don't doubt that Dubois, who can hit like a mule, connected and wobbled Anthony Joshua. What we don't know is if he lands and connects with Joshua in a week or so's time, if it will have the same effect. We don't know if Dubois will be able to engineer that opening. We don't know if Joshua will have the same mindset as he had in 2016. One would probably presume that he wouldn't. I'm not saying that Dubois can't win this fight. I'm not saying he won't knock Anthony Joshua out. But if he does, it will not be because he wobbled him 9 years ago. It will not be because Anthony Joshua has been left traumatised by what occurred in that sparring session. I understand also why this is gold dust for reporters and for the media. But it doesn't need to be Exhibit A when you're making a case for why Dubois is going to beat Joshua, because it very often is. As I've said on a different platform, how often do we get to the end of a fight when they have sparred and we then say, that was because of that sparring session they had 7 years ago? It's never a factor. So rarely a factor. top level fighters will spar. Top level fighters will get wobbled in those sparring sessions. Top level fighters will get knocked out in sparring sessions. But because of the nature of their trade, because of the nature of their psyche, they tend to get over it and they tend to learn from it. But yeah, sparring is sparring. And I know it's an overused term in boxing, but as Daniel Dubois said, when he was then asked about it, he said, "I'm not here to spar. I'm coming to fight, not spar." And there you go. It's going to be a fight, not a sparring session. And I'm very much looking forward to it.
You've been moonlighting. You've been using up your best lines elsewhere before you come on the opening bell.
No, I believe I said something like that along the lines on the Sky Sports broadcast a few months ago. I haven't been asked to go back since, mind, but at least I got that one out there.
Well done, well done. Let's talk about some of the action quickly. Last weekend, Sam Noakes, perhaps as prescribed, effectively broke down Gianluca Segla, the 34-year-old Italian who challenged for the European lightweight title previously and had lost it, but at the age of 34 against the young, hard-punching, fresh and energetic Noakes. He just looked old, he offered little, and Noakes eventually wore him down. That's 14 stoppages in 15. The only time he's gone the distance is when he won the title against Mendy last time out. Only criticism, slight criticism. And this is, I mentioned this before, didn't I? I think it was with Zelfa Barrett probably against Jordan Gill, I'd imagine, just about reading the room in terms of how you're doing in a fight and what's required. And that's usually a combination of the fighter and the corner and between them, or the corner mainly helping the fighter get that kind of objectivity that's required, or maybe subjectivity that's required in a fight to make the right decisions at the right moment. And I just felt with Noakes that Segla was there. He was offering little. I think he could have motored through him a couple of rounds earlier, but it's a minor quibble just about reading the room, because there are going to be times against better opponents where you're going to have to know if there is that avenue or when there isn't, and there definitely was there.
Yeah, and I think you're right. The word you use there is a good one. Is that it was an avenue, and it was a long avenue, and there were not going to be any obstacles placed in that avenue. Therefore, he could have stopped him whenever he liked. I think what you're saying is that in fights of greater magnitude against better opponents, that avenue becomes a window, and that window can close at any moment, and that opportunity for victory can disappear with it. So yeah, I completely hear you. I felt that as well watching it, but largely impressed with Noakes. I mean, it's no secret that they're hopefully building towards a showdown with Mark Chamberlain, and I think really that is a little treasure that they're sitting on, that I hope they don't sit on too long. They both could go separate ways. Either could come unstuck. Both are highly thought of. Both really, you look at Chamberlain versus Noakes as a fight, and I suppose at the moment it's one of those contests that only the hardcore would buy into. The difficult thing is, how do you put that on how do you continue that journey to that fight and get a lot more people interested in it so you can get the most for your investments? But for me personally, right now, as a domestic clash, that's one that I'd like to see tomorrow. I'd absolutely love to see that fight. Almost guarantees fireworks, excitement, etc. Winner moves forward. Hopefully the loser wouldn't go too far back. But I completely understand why that hasn't happened yet in the same regard.
He's a good character, Noakes. I like his mentality and I like his approach to the sport. Very level-headed, never getting ahead of himself. Said if an opportunity came against one of the big guns tomorrow, then he would take it. But I think the landscape, both in terms of domestically and European, is quite Noakes friendly. It's quite favourable to his progression. Certainly, the British title, which he holds, Regan Glacken and Carl Boyd, they have an eliminator for that in a week or so's time. That's on the 21st up in Glasgow. And the European title. Well, there's effectively an eliminator between Davardi and Acosta. That's on the 9th of, that's in September, upcoming in Spain as well. So the kind of landscape there could open him up for him to kind of defend at least his European title maybe a couple of times before he gets the experience to press on to world level. So it'll be interesting to see how he's campaigned, whether the Chamberlain fight is going to be forthcoming. Chamberlain was on one of those Saudi bills, wasn't he? Not that long ago. So maybe, if you can garner the attention of Turki Alalshikh, if you can become one of those fighters that he wants to see on his bills, then maybe Noakes can be squeezed towards Chamberlain. So we'll watch that with interest. And there was a cracking little Commonwealth title fight. Masoud Abdullah, who beat previously unbeaten Scotsman George Stewart. Stewart just didn't have the punch power to keep him off, but frenetic pace, and Abdullah was even going after him, even in the closing minutes, wasn't he? Still tried to knock him out in the 12th, which is a really good sign, given how dominant he'd kind of been throughout and on the cards.
I think we briefly mentioned that as a fight to watch, didn't we, last week? It's one of those perfect domestic chief support kind of fights where both fighters and both camps, and let's be frank about that when we say both camps, you have to get the managers on board. The managers are often the biggest stumbling block. We sit here and moan at all the evil promoters for stopping these fights from happening, but you dig a little deeper than that, and they may want those fights to happen, but they simply can't get the managers to agree, and they can't get the manager to agree a fee, they can't get the manager to agree terms. But full credit on this occasion for both camps putting their unbeaten records on the line, putting the potential, I suppose, on the line, and risking that all-important O. And I don't think either of them have come out of that any worse off than they were before. I think their profiles would have been lifted. I thought it was a really good advertisement for British boxing at domestic level. Really good advertisement for domestic British boxing. But what next now for those? Hopefully, we get to see them again on a similar bill. You were at a pretty good bill on Saturday night, weren't you? Where there was one tasty matchup in particular. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I was down at Brentwood on a Johnny Clark top tier show. He's now got a relationship with DAZN, and in truth, all the hard work and money he's been putting into it, he deserves that kind of exposure. So he's now got a relationship with DAZN. They're going to show it, I think, his bills going forward. And what you're going to get is, essentially a lot of those really good competitive, as many 50-50 fights. You're going to get some prospects. And the last two shows that I've been on, including this one and last one, Matchroom have lent a couple of their young sort of bucks. Lely Buttigieg was on this one. George Liddard was on the last show. So you've got a couple of prospects. Jimmy Sains, another super middleweight coming up, he was on the last show as well. So Matchroom basically was I think a paucity of bills to put some of their fighters on. And that's probably the Saudi exposure coming to overshadow maybe some of the careers of some of these younger fighters. Maybe it's just to give them an opportunity. I don't know. Maybe I'm speaking out of turn. Either way, that's afforded Johnny Clark an opportunity. And some of these fighters, like Lely Buttigieg on Saturday, he's a rangy young fighter. I think he's only 19. He looks like Diego Pacheco, and he's got that kind of range. As yet, he's not got the punching power, and he's earlier on in his career than Pacheco. But he won, and he looks a prospect to follow. Lily Winch made it 2-0. She's a really interesting prospect that is on Johnny Clark's shows now. She's talented. Keep an eye on her. She's one of the most natural young women fighters I've seen in a while. Absolute natural. Comfortable in the pocket. She needs to work her way down in terms of getting to the right weight, and what that's going to be remains to be seen. But she is really talented. But the fight you want to watch is the Southern Area title fight, and that's between S.A. Smith and James Osborne. Osborne was a odds-on favourite to win it, unbeaten prospect, had about 10 or 11 fights. S.A. Smith lost on a show last time to George Liddard, one of those Matchroom prospects who's unbeaten. And he had Smith down in the first round on one of the last shows a few months ago. But Smith was absolutely heroic. I mean, unbelievable courage So some might have questioned why he got to fight for the Southern Area title. Well, on Saturday night, from ringside, I got to see, and DAZN viewers got to see exactly why. Because the upset occurred. And he almost got the knockout over James Osborne as well. It was one of those give and take fights. Smith was a huge underdog. Osborne started really well. And then Smith hurt Osborne, nearly knocked him out. Osborne unbelievably came back to give himself a chance. It swung one way and the other, but the underdog won in a pulsating Southern Area title fights. And many fans will remember those as being, say, a co-feature on the old Sky Friday night fights. And they always give value for money, Matt. So go watch that.
I actually did start to this morning, but I didn't quite have enough time to finish it. It was good to hear you on comms. Always good to hear you on comms with Andy Clark and our good buddy as well. Did you manage to keep him in check?
Just. Barry Jones, just. It was hard work, but yeah, no, he was. He delivered a few crackers as usual in terms of the lines. Yeah, so he was in good form. One of our patrons bumped into Barry. Was it at the zoo or something? And got one of our patrons sent a message. I'll get to that. The other fight I'd say maybe to look out for. Elliot Whale topped the bill. He is probably one of boxing's not so hidden secrets. He's appeared on a couple of Channel 5 bills, Elliot Whale, but he's knocking people out all over the place now. He gives you a chance, but he's a hard punching southpaw, and I think he's unbeaten in 11, and he's knocked out, I think, 6 on the bounce, and he did so again at the weekend. Possibility he might be pushed together to fight this guy. He was also on the bill, Konstantin Ursu, who's also 11-0. He's more of a slickster, talented boxer, but he's been stopping people as well. And I suspect they're going to be pushed together, maybe for Harry Scarf's Commonwealth title, depending on what's going on. I think Scarf is about to defend his British title as well. I saw a board circular for that the other day. So just maybe Whale against Urshu is going to be a cracker. But yeah, keep an eye on those Johnny Clark bills that are going to be on DAZN going forward. And there's some young prospects on those. Some borrowed Matchroom and Queensbury, ex-Queensbury fighters on there as well. And some of Johnny Clark's own prospects. So worth going to look at that particular bill if you can. And let me just find that someone bumped into Barry Jones. Yeah, Jewel it was. Saying another great episode, lads. This is a Patreon of ours, Jewel. Bumped into Barry Jones yesterday at Legoland. Absolute gentleman. Also got a photo of him. Made my day. That was Jewel bumping into Barry Jones at Legoland. Fantastic. Right. Let's move on to this week because, of course, everything points to the T-Mobile, which is fast becoming the home for Canelo Alvarez. 20-1 on to beat Edgar Berlanga, who's talking a good fight, the unbeaten New Yorker with Puerto Rican descent. I think it's probably... Is it an exaggerated version of what I thought was going to happen between Madrimov and Crawford? This is a big step up for Berlanga. Is he up to it, Matt?
We'll see on Saturday, won't we? He's certainly talking a good game. Some of the things he's saying, he is using two different... He's saying two things, one of which is about respect. He respects Canelo, but there isn't too much respect, and there's an awful lot of ambition in there. And I think the biggest upsets are crafted when there's an element of respect, but ultimately what overrides that is self-belief. But it is a ginormous leap. I think we can mention and talk about the fact that Canelo is not the same fighter that he used to be. But I think with that we can balance that out with saying he may not necessarily be a worse fighter than he used to be. He's a different fighter. He's a more economical fighter. Tris Dixon has done a couple of pieces for Boxing Scene this week. Both are worth reading, one of which is where he goes into the punch stats. Oh, sorry, guys. Everything froze there, people at home. Sorry, everything froze, and I thought we'd stopped. So he goes into the punch stats, and you can see that Canelo's accuracy, since he was down at junior middleweight, has kind of more or less, it's improved slightly. However, his punch output, particularly when compared to when he was at middleweight, which is when he was at his busiest, it's an awful lot slower. So He's not all guns blazing, although I think you can argue he never really was. He was always a very clever fighter, always knew when to launch his attacks. But I think that may explain why he's not getting as many knockouts. I don't think it's because all of a sudden he's not punching as hard. It's because he's not punching as often. But I think that also might make him a little bit more difficult to beat. He's not presenting his opponents with the opportunity to counter him. So if you compare him, for example, I think the moment where he learned his lesson was in the first Gennady-Golovkin fight back in 2017, where he was getting caught an awful lot in the first 8 or 9 rounds in particular against Gennady-Golovkin, and he seemed to readjust that mindset and that approach for the rematch. And I think his rematch was probably when I saw him at his very best. But since then, and I think that's why he likes fighters like Berlanga. Tris speaks to a few different people. I think he speaks to Sugar Hill Stewart, he speaks to Russ Abner, and I think he speaks to Eddie Hearn. And something that Eddie Hearn says is that he's not in decline, but there are certain fighters now that he wants to fight. He wants to fight people that will come to him and allow him to be at his best. He's not going to have to dictate the pace. And I think with someone like Berlanga, who started life as a knockout artist, first 16 fights were 1-round KOs, he is going to come at Canelo and perhaps make life a little bit easier for him. So having said that, you can then accuse Canelo of just picking who he wants to fight, not fighting the most deserving. But I think if Berlanga's biggest chance in this fight is that Canelo is past his best, I think we should probably forget about that one. I think Berlanga's biggest chance is that he rises to the occasion and he turns in an incredible performance that stuns us all. And I just don't think he's got it in him against someone like Canelo, who, though we can see he's slowing down, we still haven't seen him in a performance where we've got to the end of it and gone, oh my gosh, he's just not what he was. He's not effective. He is still effective, very effective, one of the best in the sport, pound for pound, at what he does. And I simply don't think Berlanga has got it in his locker to win this fight. I might be wrong. And I don't think, and you mentioned Madrimov, I think we both seriously underrated Madrimov going into that fight, but we both knew that Madrimov was a well-schooled, well-educated fighter who could box. I'm not saying Berlanga can't box, but I don't think he can box well enough to have sustained periods of success against someone like Canelo.
No, the situation with Madrimov was purely one of styles, wasn't it? The way that Madrimov had jumped into attacks previously, but he didn't fight like that against Crawford. Understandably, of course, too intelligent, too good a fighter really to do that. So maybe we'll see a different version of Berlanga, but will we see a much better version? What we saw with Madrimov was a fighter who tailored his approach to the fighter that was in front of him, and rightly so. And so we got a more circumspect, cautious to an extent, but appropriately cautious Madrimov, who boxed more on the inside and his attacks were more circumspect. What we have with Berlanga is someone who is probably just an inexperienced version and arguably not as strong or tough a version as Jaime Munguia was, who Canelo beat last time up. Munguia lasted out against Canelo because of his youth, his attitude, and his toughness. And I'm not saying that Berlanga doesn't have all of those three attributes. He may well have, and he perhaps has glimpses of them, but Does he have that whole package that Munguia had that allowed him to get through the experience and, in truth, compete on even terms in some moments, some rounds against Canelo? I don't know if Berlanga can do that, personally. I don't think he's even as good as Munguia. So how does Canelo do it? How does the fight unfold? Those are two of the biggest ideas when you're visualizing this particular fight. Is Berlanga going to come at Canelo in there? So we see some of the high guard counters that Canelo can produce. The fast right hand, for example, whip in the body shots as well, quite possibly. What we know with Canelo is that he rations his attacks these days. But we also know that while he hasn't stopped anyone in a while, he has hurt and put opponents down repeatedly, Matt, hasn't he? Munguia with that uppercut in the 4th round, Charlo in the 7th. Munguia got through it because he was so young, so tough, and he just refused to be stopped. Charlo got through it because he backpedaled, got on his bike and didn't engage. John Ryder got through that 5th round, I have no idea how, against Canelo, because he looked sure to get knocked out. But that was just toughness and heroism beyond the call of duty on that night from John Ryder, aided and abetted by Canelo's output and age down the stretch where he couldn't or wouldn't finish him when he had the chance. So there's a load of ingredients in terms of how this fight unfolds, and whether Berlanga can hear the final bell. All of those things are at play, whether he does or doesn't.
If you look at their respective form in recent years, I think Canelo getting another clear, trouble-free 12-round decision might be the smart bet. I've got a feeling, though, that Canelo might actually get the stoppage here because I think the disparity in skill levels will allow him to produce something spectacular. But I think if it goes past 6... even if Berlanga is under some serious pressure, I think it may then just go the distance. I think if Canelo's going to do it, he's going to do it in the first half of the fight. I think he's at his most dangerous in his first half of the fight. I think when you compare him to his old self, he's at his most ambitious in the first half of the fight. I think that ambition turns to contentment the longer the fight goes on, that he's not going to lose, that he's quite enjoying it, that he doesn't want to exhaust himself. So, yeah, but I do think that Berlanga's desire to impress, I think this is being billed as Puerto Rico versus Mexico, isn't it? Berlanga, I think, in a way that someone like Charlo didn't, for example, might sense that this is, he has to go for it. The only way he's going to do this, he doesn't need to hear the final bell, he needs to win. And the only way he's going to win is to go for it. And I think in the process of doing that, he will present Canelo with 1 or 2 opportunities to finish the fight early. But it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest if it does go 12 and Canelo doesn't particularly gain many plaudits for it. Everybody, again, is screaming for David Benavidez to be in the opposite corner. And on that, Roy Jones Jr. said something really interesting this week, didn't he? Where he said Canelo has earned the right, and he's got every right to fight whoever he wants, given the career that he's had, given who he's fought in the past, given the platform that he's created for himself, and given the audience that he's kind of performing to. It's up to him. He says, but do not for 1 second think or fall into that media narrative that Canelo's running from Benavidez. He's going to be aware he's at a stage of his career, and this is what Roy Jones is saying. Canelo will be aware that he's at a stage of his career where there's only so many rivals out there where he will be able to earn an absolute fortune and a contextual or comparative fortune to what he's earning now. One of those will be Terence Crawford, the other one will be David Benavidez. And if he doesn't feel he can get that money for David Benavidez right now, he'll wait until he can. In much the same way that Mayweather did against Manny Pacquiao, we remember. People were furious that fight wasn't happening. But one of Floyd Mayweather's first lines in the post-fight press conference, while he had his $200 million check in hand, was, if I'd have taken that fight 3 or 4 years ago, these figures would not say 200 million. I waited and I did it the right way. He was not waiting for Pacquiao to get old. He was waiting for the anticipation to reach fever pitch. And Roy Jones Jr. has suggested that Canelo will make damn sure that he is getting paid as much as he possibly can if he's going to go in with someone as difficult and as hard to beat as David Benavidez. But he is not for 1 second frightened. So I think there's that. So you could argue in this fight against Berlanga, he's marking time. It's a fight that he quite fancies. He likes Berlanga. He'll get paid well while he waits. But he will have an exit route, you would imagine, at this point. I think Canelo himself at this point said, I'm not looking necessarily at my career as a whole. It's just event by event, and I'm doing the best for myself with each event. I wouldn't be in the slightest bit surprised if Benavidez and Canelo was to happen far sooner than any of us think it will. And I never believed that Canelo is running scared of David Benavidez. I don't think there's any history of Canelo necessarily running scared. I know he took his sweet time to get to Golovkin, took his sweet time to acclimatise to the middleweight division. But having been there at certain press conferences back then, when Canelo had just beaten Cotto, Canelo is left to his own devices. On the dais, people are throwing questions at him. What's next? He's like, I want Golovkin. I want Golovkin next. I want it in a few months' time. 160, absolutely fine. 10 minutes later, Oscar De La Hoya turns up. No, I think we still need to take our time. He's not quite big enough as a middleweight yet before we fight Golovkin. We need to make sure that is as big a fight as it can possibly be. And this is what people don't see and people don't understand. When they just see a headline, Canelo at the moment isn't going to fight Benavidez, they think he's running scared, when there's an awful lot going on behind the scenes. But as for this week, I'll go out there and I'll say Canelo will get the stoppage. Round 5, he'll look fantastic doing it, and there'll be a bit more of a buzz about him again.
I think he should stop Berlanga. I'm not convinced that he will, but I think he should. But we'll see. Caleb Plant back on that bill. Danny Garcia back against Erislandy Lara. Moving up to middleweight, though he probably won't weigh anywhere near middleweight, will he? He'd probably be 155, 156 or something like that. And also Stephen Fulton back on that bill as well. His first fight since losing to Inoue. All of that coming up this weekend. Coming up next is This Week. This week, we take you back to the 9th of September 2017 at a sold-out StubHub in California for Srikasets or Rungvisai against Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez, the rematch. Rungvisai getting the nod when they'd met previously some 6 months earlier at Madison Square Garden on a Golovkin undercard. Chocolatito and Golovkin went hand in glove, didn't they? On numerous occasions. I think Chocolatito fought on 5 Golovkin bills over the course of the year, including in March at Madison Square Garden, where the majority of decision had gone the way of Rungvisai, quite controversially for many. That was on Golovkin against Danny Jacobs, and despite the fact that, according to the punch stats, Chocolatito had landed 441 of 1,014 punches thrown, some way more than Rungvisai, who got the nod, and hence the fact we had a rematch, Matt.
Yeah, and I mean, that first fight was tainted somewhat by that decision. I mean, for me, from memory, I haven't watched it back. I should have watched it back, really, as part of watching this rematch, but I haven't watched that first fight back. But at the time, I felt that Chocolatito had done enough. What I was taken with, what I took away with me as well, was what a cracking fight it was. And really, it was between that fight and Joshua Klitschko as to what was the fight of the year. It was a rip-roarer, and it wasn't far off being level pegging with Joshua Klitschko. So for people that haven't seen that but have seen Joshua Klitschko, that should put some context to what a good fight that first one was. Yeah, the old CompuBox stats. Chocolatito landed 441 apparently, and Srikasets landed 284 apparently. But yeah, there was no doubt that Chocolatito did appear to be the more accurate and the busier in that first fight. But it wasn't a decision that left me absolutely enraged. I could just about make a case for Srisaket nicking it if you would go back and study certain rounds, etc., etc., etc. When you said we were going to do this fight, I thought, crikey, when was that? About 2014? It felt like a long time ago, and really it isn't. It was 2017. It was a week, actually, before Canelo Golovkin won, wasn't it? This, by the way, if this feels like a long time ago, 2017... This was probably about 14 months after Dubois nearly chinned Anthony Joshua in a sparring session, by the way. So that's how long ago that took place. But yeah, the whole Srisaket Sorung Vasai story was one that was gold for the media who were working in boxing, who worked for outlets that would cover super flyweights. Came from a poor family from Sisaket province in Thailand, and he moved to Bangkok at the age of 13 to try and escape that poverty. There's a story, isn't there, about him walking 60 or 70 miles or something for a job interview just to be a refuse collector in Bangkok. There's numerous tales about him eating all manner of horrors out of bins when he was a teenager. So it was that kind of archetypal, horrible, difficult, poverty-stricken upbringing that fueled the belief within to grow up to become a world champion. But the vast majority of people genuinely believed that Chocolatito would win this fight, given that the vast majority believed he won the first one. But there was something within Srisaket. He was talking beforehand that he believed in himself more than he had at any point, more than during that 60 or 70 mile walk, more than when he was kind of scrapping for survival on the streets. He believed in himself to this fight. And one of the interesting things that he said beforehand is that he only had, I think it was 7 weeks training camp for the first fight. And I did that on 7 weeks. For this one, he had 16 weeks or 4 months. And you could almost see the difference in the opening minute of this rematch, couldn't you?
Oh, it's remarkable. I mean, often in the introductions, Roman Gonzalez almost had a kind of sheepish way about him. That was just part of him. Very, very down to earth in terms of his approach, and outwardly and visually, he would always have that almost hangdog expression, sheepish look on his face. So it's easy to read too much into his expressions in the build up to this. But if you go to the other corner, there's just the absolute energy that is fizzing around Rung Vasai and his team. The smiles, Manny Pacquiao-esque on the way to the ring, in the ring, bouncing on his toes, on his heels, just delighted to be there and ready to go and express himself. And there is a confidence. There's a burgeoning confidence in his demeanour. And it's emphatic right from the very first bell. And the contrast, I mean, they pick it up in the commentary. They may be overdoing it, but they pick up the contrast. Max Kellerman alongside Jim Lampley and the HBO team about Gonzalez, about Rung Vasai, and almost the difference between them and the way that they're trying to express themselves through those early rounds. And we don't really get, I think, bar in the third, where Chocolatito tries to get on the front foot. Everything's a bit forced, but he's trying. Bar that, it's quite a subdued, underwhelming Chocolatito, isn't it? He just doesn't seem like himself. But whether Rung Vasai is just the bogeyman, Matt, or whether just on this night and at this period of his boxing life, he was almost unstoppable. Go on to beat Estrada after this, defend his title 3 times. He was a force of nature at this particular time. But on this night, right from the start, against Chocolatito, 1 defeat in 47 fights, and that was controversial a few months previously. Against Gonzalez, Rung Vasai was dominant.
He was, and I think full credit to, you mentioned the commentators, that was something I made a note of, in that So it was Lampley, it was Kellerman, and I think it was Andre Ward, wasn't it? Were calling the fight, and Lampley in particular had spoke of the sense of injustice around the first fight. I think they had all mentioned that this fight, therefore, should be easier for Chocolatito. They were all expecting Chocolatito to win it. And I think logically he should have done. He would have been aware of the threat of Srisaket. He would have perhaps been fueled by that, his record, his precious unbeaten record, being blotted by poor judging from his point of view. However, he just didn't look right to start off with. But I think, and you'll be a better person to answer to speak on this than me. I think as a commentator, you'd be quite careful about so quickly saying that he looks off, saying that the underdog is going to win, because they're all saying it really in the first round. I think by the second round, Andre Ward was already saying that Srisaket looks like he was going to win. By the third and fourth, it was, and before the first knockdown, they were all in agreement that this was going to be a gigantic upset. Credit to them for that. Had Gonzalez have worked through that crisis, they may have been made to look like they were siding with the wrong person too early. But they all seemed to get a very good reading of the contest, probably within about the first minute. So yeah, full credit to them for that. What was your thinking in that?
Yeah.
From the point of view as a commentator, when you're witnessing what perhaps might be a monumental upset?
I suppose it's twofold. One, as a commentator, you are trying just to pick up the vibe and call it as you're seeing it. But as a viewer, are we leaning towards that point of view just because they've picked up on it? Or is it an actual real reflection of what it is that's unfolding before our eyes? And sometimes ringside, you will just pick up on something that isn't necessarily obvious from watching it at home. But yeah, fair play. They were right onto it, weren't they, from the start? And you do feel, looking at Gonzalez and us as fans knowing Gonzalez and how he has traditionally been a slow starter in his fights. So, he can go through a first round not having a look, but just kind of working towards something, working things out. But then it's usually very early on and he just flows. And, Gonzalez is one of the best offensive fighters I think we've ever seen in the lower weights, in terms of that busy, beautiful flow of dynamism and energy. But he just was never really, bar the third round, there was never a sense of that. And therefore you were left with both the image and the idea that he wasn't himself on this particular night. And the difficulty is, even now, looking back at it, having watched it again and again, is to know whether it was simply because Rungvisai is the bogeyman for Gonzalez and was on this night, and was at this particular part of his career where he was something else, or whether Gonzalez was off on this night. And you have to feel, given what we know about what Gonzalez did before and what he went on to do amazingly afterwards, that it was a bad night. And it was probably a bad night made worse by your opponent being on song and at it. That's my reading of it.
Yeah, I think we can look back now retrospectively and say it was a bad night at the office, wasn't it? I think if we are going to be critical, and I say it with the greatest respect, I like Max Kellerman, but his kind of closing statement when he was knocked out was a little bit, right, that is the end of Gonzalez, it's the end of an era every now and again. And he kind of repeated it. He was interrupted mid-flow and he went, as I was saying, every now and again in boxing history, something happens in a great fight or whatever he was saying. So I think, but in his defence, I felt exactly the same. Because after a long old career like Gonzalez had had at that point, and being a relatively old man when you put it in the context of the light divisions, and suffering a knockout where he is out, more or less out cold on his back, at that stage of his career, that takes some coming back from. So you can understand where Max Kellerman was coming from with that statement at the end of the fight. I wondered before I rewatched this fight this morning when I was thinking, well, I wonder what did happen to him. I wondered prior to watching the fight if there was a bit of overconfidence about Chocolatito, but his body language didn't give out that, as you've already touched upon, before the fight. So you do wonder if something was off behind the scenes, which may well have been the case. I think there was also the headbutt, wasn't there? There was a clash of heads early in the fight, which may have immediately just made his focus go to another place or allow him to get a little bit frustrated and angry, particularly when memories of the pesky head of Srisaket from the first fight are still fresh in his brain, where in the end Srisaket got a point deducted. Gonzalez was cut, wasn't he? And immediately he's thinking, I just don't want to fight this guy. In a similar way to Holyfield-Tyson 2, when Tyson was left enraged by Holyfield using his head in the rematch, and in the end bit a chunk of Holyfield's ear off. Psychologically in warfare, I can only imagine the complexities of it when you are presented with an enemy like Srisaket, or from Tyson's point of view, like Holyfield, that starts to do the things that bothered you last time. And I think we have it in relationships. We all have little quirks that get on other people's nerves, and we can be in their company again and they do that thing that gets on your nerves. You're like, oh my God, and it really sends your head into a spin. In a fight, imagine what that does, particularly when you find it uncomfortable. So, yeah, I don't know. But having watched it again, aside from what we don't know that went on behind the scenes as to why Gonzalez wasn't right, I would say the headbutt may have played a part in it in the early rounds.
I think you're right, Matt. I think you're right, because Jim Lampley talks about that particular subject that was brought up in the fighter meetings, and it was essentially brought up by Gonzalez, Chocolatito, who said that he was trying to find a way to approach the fight to avoid that. And they all talk about it. Andre Ward reflects on that, and he's just saying that's madness. As a fighter, you can't. How can you, especially with Gonzalez's style, which is very much offense heavy? You know, everything is front foot, and I'm going to outwork you. I'm going to do it with class, and it's going to be effective. It's just a swarming, intelligent front foot pressure. But if that's your style, and you're then thinking about how do you avoid getting headbutts, then you're not doing your thing. You're not approaching the fight in the way that you normally do. So I definitely think there's that. There's a kind of psychological handicap or hurdle for him before he even gets into this fight. And unfortunately, there's a memory of it in the very first round, because the heads come together in the first and then they come together in the second. So there's two real psychological reinforcements very early on of all the things you were worried about, of all the ideas that were formulating in your brain about how you'd approach the fight. And the worst case scenario is unfolding right at the very start. So I have no doubt that played a part. Now, you'd like to think that someone with his class and experience would find a way to overcome that. But even the best have their difficulties. Even the best have off nights. And this was one of those. And I think that's probably at the heart of it. It may just be, and people might be throwing things at their computer or their car system and saying, no, Rungvisai, he was always just going to beat Chocolatito. And they might be right. And maybe this version of Rungvisai, sort of 2016 through to 2018, 2019, maybe he just beats them all. Maybe. It's quite possible. I'm not going to argue with that. But I do think psychologically there's something at the heart of what you've just spoken about regarding Gonzalez, regarding the headbutts. Those lines from Kellerman and Lampley. The Chocolatito we once knew no longer exists, says Kellerman. And then Lampley says, it will be years before anybody talks about him, meaning Gonzalez, without saying the name Srisaket Rungvisai. In other words, that this heavy knockout defeat in 4 rounds, down twice in the final round, that's going to haunt and follow Gonzalez forevermore. Well, ultimately, both of those lines prove folly, which underlines how you can never be too dogmatic about one night, one fight, one fighter, one punch. That's just the sport wrapped up in a bundle, isn't it? This fight, from the last fight to the rest of their careers, that is boxing. You just never know.
You can understand why they said it, though, can't
Totally.
you? You can completely understand it. I mean, Lampley was there when Antonio Tarver knocked out Roy Jones. And the thing is, when fighters who are or were as good and dominant as Chocolatito was, and would be again to a degree, it's a real shock to the senses when you see them knocked out. And 9 times out of 10, when that fighter is knocked out, there's no way back for them. And I think however, and we speak with the benefit of hindsight, of course, we can look back on what he went on to do. Although I was in that camp completely on that night, thinking that's the end for him. But rather than Srisaket kind of defining him, I think it's the manner in which he rebounded from that, which has added another layer to the Chocolatito legend. I think even when Chocolatito went in with... It was Kal Yafai. So he'd had a couple of almost like tune-up type fights against decent opposition, in fairness. But I'm not sure if I'd pick Yafai, but I thought that this might be when we do get to see the end for Chocolatito. And he was so dominant against Yafai, and then we know that he's also beaten Julio Cesar Martinez. Now, he's had the 2 fights with Estrada, which could have gone either way, but great fights, where when you see Gonzalez get knocked out in this fight, it's a shock that he stays on his feet or he hears the final bell against Estrada in those hellacious 24 rounds. There's nothing wrong with his durability in those fights. So the manner in which he's rebuilt himself to almost be where he was before, where are we? 8 years down the line is incredible.
It's unbelievable.
And that is the story here, because that doesn't happen when great fighters are humbled to such a degree that Chocolatito was on this night against Srisaket.
And I totally understand why the commentators, I'm not digging them out, I totally understand why they made those statements at the time, because it is almost impossible to believe that Chocolatito would get back to anything like his best on the back of this. And the amazing thing is, now, when you look at his career in total, obviously he came back just the other month off a break, didn't he, of a couple of years. He came back and won he won a knockout in the 10th round back home just the other month. But you couldn't have imagined that he'd had those give and takes with Estrada, 5 years later? 4 and 5 years later. Just can't, it seems impossible to imagine. No. And when you think, Matt, when you think now about his career, whether it's ended or not, this night against Rungvisai, arguably, this is the only fight he's ever lost. Arguably, debatably.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point. And it's not like this happened early on in his career. If this happened early on in his career, there's every chance you rebuild. There's every chance that you can get back to where you were, because it was at such an advanced stage of his career where I think everybody was already in agreement that he was a lock for the Hall of Fame, given what he'd achieved and how he had looked while doing so. That he came back and he's still active today. He's certainly slowed down, but he's still active. He's still formidable. Yeah, it's incredible, really. And I think this doesn't become a black mark on Gonzalez's career as a consequence. It's a mere bookmark that I think we need to use as reference when talking about what a great fighter he is.
And this is a period that will become part of boxing history, and will become one of the best periods in the super flyweight boxing history. You've got Rungvisai and Gonzalez. Both would go on to fight Estrada with mixed success. Rungvisai would beat Estrada the following year. He'd lose to him the year after that. Both of those really competitive, close fights. Gonzalez, of course, would would lose twice, split and majority decisions to Estrada in 2021 and 2022. And then, of course, you throw Quadras into the mix, belatedly Bam Rodriguez, who would beat Rungvisai, wouldn't he? Though Rungvisai in 2022 was coming off a year-plus layoff, so you've got to factor that in, as impressive as Bam Rodriguez was on the night. And also on this night in 2017, a certain Naoya Inoue was part of the mix as well. Now, he was on the undercard. I'd totally forgotten about this other American visit for Inoue. Totally forgot about him. I remember the lockdown visit with Top Rank in the Las Vegas bubble, but I'd forgotten that Inoue had defended his WBO title on this night against Nieves. Probably because Nieves was a US-based fighter, partly because it was a kind of taken co-promotion as well. Yeah, the stop-up. So Inoue beat Nieves, and Estrada outpointed Quadras on this night of the Superflies. All of those names woven together in one of the best periods of super flyweight history.
It will go down in history. I think if there was any justice, it would go down not only as a great period for this division, it should go down as a great period for the sport. I remember writing about it at the time, saying, why can the rest of the sport not learn from what this particular division is doing at the moment? But I think it shows you, doesn't it? I'd forgotten about Inoue, and I remember writing about Inoue at the time being on the bill, but I'd forgotten that he was on this bill. Like you, I remember him fighting Maloney in lockdown. But again, that gives you some more context to how long ago this was. Because Inoue, though he was well regarded by the aficionados of this world, and obviously people out in Japan, he wasn't anything like the superstar that he is today. But yeah, I mean, what a period for the sport. And just a little reminder of how good most divisions could be. Now we were also blessed during this period where you could probably mention 8 fighters in the super flyweight division who you could classify as great around this kind of 10-year period. So not every division is going to be blessed with that, but we should also know by now that the key is to match the best fighters in the division with their closest rivals. And this is what they were doing time after time. And most impressively of all, I don't ever recall a single story about things struggling at the negotiating table, people digging their heels in, saying, well, I'm not fighting unless I can fight him 17 times altogether, and things like that. It just wasn't. They would be like, yeah, what's next? Right, gotcha, I'll take it. And that's what it seemed to be. Obviously, I'm not privy to it, but that's how it appeared. Now, there is also a lot of truth in the fact that down at super flyweight, you're not presented with many opportunities to earn big. Therefore, you have to take on your biggest rival, your closest rivals. But yeah, this period of time in the super flyweight division should absolutely be cherished.
There's actually one of the press conferences I think it's for this fight actually, where Tom Loeffler is talking about exactly that. You know, thanks to everyone for making this happen. There's a YouTube presser about exactly that subject. So Rungvisai against Gonzalez 2 from 2017, and within days, literally days later, having watched this in the UK, Matt and I independently would be making our way to Las Vegas for Golovkin against Canelo 1 the week after this. What a time to be alive. Thanks to you lovely Patreons. There's another bonus pod dropping in your inbox, and that'll be coming up this weekend. So stay tuned for that, and plenty more coming up besides.
And for those of you that are not yet Patreons, and we hope and have faith that one day you will make the switch, there is a free sample for you of what we're doing now with the Boxing Best series that we record and is released every Saturday exclusively for Patreons. But we thought it'd be a good idea to allow the rest of you, before you put your hands in your pockets, to have a listen. And this weekend, I believe that Boxing's Best events will be published on the standard feed, where we talk in depth, actually, about what happened on that trip to Las Vegas when we both were in the same arena to watch Golovkin versus Canelo.
Yeah, that one of several stories from that particular pod. So that's a teaser coming your way this weekend. And the Patreons will be getting another special coming up this weekend as well. And plenty more in the coming weeks. Thanks to all of you for your continued support. Take care. Speak to you soon. Bye for now.